General Ulysses S. Grant is a complex figure in the minds of Americans. Some historians claim Grant was a drunk, and politicians from his era slandered him as such. One politician, Alexander McClure, accused Grant of being a lush directly to Lincoln. McClure begged Lincoln to dismiss him. President Lincoln's answer: "I can't spare this man. He fights." According to newspapers, Lincoln was also reported saying he would send whatever whiskey Grant was drinking to every general in his army because Grant was so good at making war. Grant himself told his wife that he was sober as a deacon, no matter what was said. Other history sources claim that Grant, like Lincoln and Tecumseh Sherman, suffered from depression. That Grant was an average military student at best. That Grant was cruel as a Civil War general. That he was bloodthirsty and vicious. And that if it wasn't for the war, Grant would still be penniless and selling firewood in the streets of St. Louis. Regardless of how he got there, regardless of how many rumors were true, whether Grant was kind or vicious, drunk or sober, depressed or simply worn down by a nation feeding itself into a meat grinder, when General Grant came to the peace table, he found compassion. In fact, the most remarkable part of Grant's compassion might stem from his personal flaws, not in spite of them. Grant had been plucked from a life of poverty and dropped into a terrible conflict. And when Grant finally fought his way to the peace table to put an end to the Civil War, he found himself sitting across from Robert E. Lee, a wealthy, educated gentleman. Robert E. Lee was born the son of a Virginian governor, attended West Point Military Academy with Grant, and Lee arrived at their meeting in a new, pristine uniform. Grant was still in his muddy field uniform. Grant, if his vicious reputation was to be believed, was about to feed Lee his saber and crush the Confederates under the Union boot. But instead, Grant sat, talked about their shared experience during the Mexican War, and spoke cordially with Robert E. Lee for about a half an hour before Lee's surrender was even brought up. Grant even admitted that he was embarrassed to talk of surrender, but they had business to get out of the way. Two sides of the aisle would be too generous a way to describe how these men came together. Lee and Grant had been trying to kill each other for the past 4 years. So when Lee sheepishly admitted to needing a favor from Grant to save his starving Confederate soldiers who wouldn't make it home without aid, Grant showed compassion. Grant ordered 25,000 rations to be sent to the hungry Confederates who hadn't eaten in several days. And Grant sent further instructions to his officers that any Confederate soldier who owned his horse or mule could keep it, to make farming, plowing, and peace easier when they got home. For Grant's reputation of being such a hard-drinking bastard on the battlefield, the level of compassion he showed was enough to convince Robert E. Lee that the best course of action was for his men to return home and for everyone to resume their life as American citizens. You're listening to The Re-Engineered You. This is a podcast about self-empowerment and all the myths, lies, and misconceptions we tell ourselves. Then we use science and history to bust those myths and re-engineer a better you. I'm your host, Todd Laments, the extrovert.
And I'm the writer, researcher, and introvert, Joe Anthony, whose job it is to dig through the outer layer of no doubt on the internet and get to the facts.
After the first COVID stimulus went out in March of 2020, politicians began asking the question, what happens if more money is needed? The overwhelming answer from the Republican-led House was no more stimuluses before November, meaning they didn't want to send out another round of payments before the election. In response, several news sources started talking about a phenomenon known as compassion fatigue. Basically, the news was accusing politicians of becoming numb to the number of people who were dying or being evicted. Because things had been so awful for so long, their nerves had become deadened to the suffering of their voters. Today, we want to get to the bottom of compassion and compassion fatigue. And as two politically independent podcasters, we're taking a hard look at 3 myths that might seem to be under suspicion even now, after the second COVID relief bill was just passed. Myths like: Myth 1, when do we become numb to numbers? When does the death toll rise too high for us to visualize its meaning? How many people have to die for compassion fatigue to set in? Myth 2, compassion is the sole domain of humans, right? Do other animals feel sad for each other's misfortunes? Or are they literally crying crocodile tears? Myth 3, how does compassion die? Is there such thing as a scarcity mindset? Which human instinct is stronger? The instinct to reach down and help pull up the unfortunate, or the instinct to pull the ladder up behind us? We're going to look at our compassion reserves to find out how deep it goes. But first, I want to talk to Joe about why Grant was such an interesting general, given the circumstances surrounding his questionable mental health.
So when you think of compassionate figures in history, do you think of like Mother Teresa, or who's somebody else who like has done a lot of good for people?
Well, I think of her, right? Because if you Google that, she's the first one that pops into everybody's mind.
Right. She's like healing the sick and caring for people.
Yeah, I think of Gandhi too, helping people.
Right. Infinite reserves of compassion. I went looking for, when we started doing research for this episode, specifically for people that shouldn't have been compassionate. Like in the moment, their blood was hot. They had no reason at that second to... I mean, people who are experienced with war will probably argue with me on that one, that, like, of course, you're supposed to be able to come to the peace table when it demands it, like, whenever you have the opportunity. But this is, I mean, like our narrative said, this is a guy who just got done fighting his way through one of the most brutal wars in history.
Well, yeah, and then there's someone earlier that morning tried to kill you.
Right, exactly. And they're of a different socioeconomic class. Like they're not eye to eye. One of them barely passed West Point, the other one flying colors and from a prestigious family.
So you can see kind of taking your boot and pushing them, their head back into the mud, right?
Right, exactly. But that's depending on the source, that's not really what Grant did. He actually showed compassion. Whereas you look at our current group of politicians from either side of the aisle, they don't seem to have too much of that. They don't have that Grant compassion in them so much. So, do you remember our Vulnerable Leaders episode?
I do very much. That's one of our more popular ones. We've had a lot of people reach out to us that listen to it over and over. And the gist was how clinically depressed Lincoln was his whole life.
Right. He was clinically depressed, and in that episode, we argue there is a evolutionary reason for depression, that it turns humans into brooding machines temporarily. So we kind of want to hit on that a little bit with Grant. He, by most sort of historical standards, probably had some form of anxiety or depression, on top of his poverty, on top of his sort of rocky upbringing and any superstition he brought to the table. So yada, yada, yada. I'll let Todd be the voice of the past for this one.
Well, I've studied, how much I love American history, and the Civil War is obviously rich with just history, American history, and how it changed our country and changed the world. But I found some interesting facts about Grant that I didn't know. Do you know he was supposed to be there the night that Lincoln was assassinated?
Really?
Yeah, he was supposed to be there at that play and be sitting right next to. So he had overwhelming guilt, Joe, because he thinks if he would have been there, war general, he probably could have saved the president.
True, unless he was as much of a drunk as people accused him of, then he would just be sort of like napping next to Lincoln when Lincoln got it.
Be pissing himself and puking in the bathroom.
Sawing logs when a pop goes off. Okay, so Grant could have potentially prevented an assassination.
Another thing was he was a terrible, notoriously unlucky businessman. After spending a decade in the army in the Mexican-American War, he spent the next 7 years as a farmer, a real estate agent.
Real estate?
Yeah, and a rent collector. I don't know what that's. That sounds like a goon. That sounds like a mafia kind of thing.
Yeah, I've heard of collecting rent and collecting rent on cattle and things like that back then. Real estate? Is it?
Did you think in 1854 there was like a century realtor?
No. Are they? I want to imagine that he's hanging up actual like real estate signs, and instead of being in front of like duplexes, it's in front of like muddy fields. Like just a picture of the muddy field on the sign in front of a muddy field.
Well, he eked out, barely existed by selling firewood in the streets of St. Louis.
Okay, so he was literally selling sticks of wood out of his arms.
Yeah, that can't pay that great.
I've seen kids do that with flowers in front of Albertsons, so that can't have been enough to sustain him or a family.
He also, after he was president, so he was a war general, then he used that fame to kind of get himself in the White House. And then after that, him and his son started up a financial business, and it went sideways. It went bankrupt very quickly.
Okay, so presidency did not help his financial acumen.
This one I really love. He was responsible in the 1860s to break up the Ku Klux Klan.
Wow. Okay.
I didn't know that. So he was before his time with a lot of minority rights. So he ran the Klan out of business, and it wouldn't come back. I mean, he exterminated. It didn't come back until the 1910s.
Okay, so he gave him a run for their money for quite some time.
Now, last but not least, we talked about him with Robert E. Lee, the Virginian governor's son, the higher class. He could have charged him with treason after the Civil War, so he could have been shot or hung. What do they do with people with treason back then? I think you're done, right?
Yeah, I think you hung.
He prevented that from being done. He prevented Robert E. Lee from being killed, so he forgave him and God gave him a pass.
Wow, okay.
Which probably wasn't very popular at the time.
So I didn't even touch on that writing the opening narrative, but that's another act of compassion that can sort of be filed under Grant.
Maybe that's why Robert E. Lee was so nice to him at that meeting.
Probably, yeah. Let's talk about the weather for 30 minutes, please. Do you want to start talking about the science of compassion? Because... Okay, so right now, like as we start recording, the current COVID death numbers are 544,000 in the U.S. Can you mentally visualize that many?
No, and this whole time's been going on, and what I heard the other day, maybe a month ago, I read is like there's more people dying today than died in September 11th with the attacks on New York. So that's how I tried to kind of put it in some kind of in my head.
Right, some kind
but
of
I still
context.
can't. I mean, can you?
Yeah, September 11th was 2,977 people killed during the hijacking. We're going to really try to visualize 500,000 right now. To give you an idea, again, we looked this up. None of us have this on the top of our heads. The largest stadium in the world is Rungrado, and that's 114,000 people that it can hold, followed closely by Melbourne Cricket Ground at 100,000. So the biggest stadium we could find was 1/5 of who has died during COVID. We also have cities, because that's the next closest thing we could get if you want to visualize how many people that is. Tulsa, Oklahoma is 558,000. Followed closely by Fresno, California, Raleigh, North Carolina, Grand Rapids, Michigan, and New Haven. So those are roughly the same amount.
So far, right?
So far, yeah.
Yeah.
So we can kind of put this number in a bucket, but to imagine the people, there is something that takes place in the mind where we start becoming numb by numbers. The more numbers, actually, the more effective it is to sort of numb you. Do you want to get into the neurology and psychology of why that happens?
Yes, I'm interested.
Okay. I also I haven't pitched this yet. We have friends in local politics. Not that we are in local politics, but I'm eventually going to try to pitch the idea of doing a mass campaign. When this whole thing is over, we need to hang 544,000 like COVID masks in like a blanket or a quilt or just on a sign, so people can actually see the number, because that would be absolutely mind-blowing. It would be the size of a large flag, I think. So this comes from a Psychology Today article. This is by Sarah Elizabeth Richards, and she's talking about COVID, like that she specifically calls out COVID's enormous death toll. And she quotes National Geographic too, talking about why our minds can't make sense of the enormous death toll. She wrote that a story about a single tragic death evokes waves of sadness and emotion for us. We focus on individual details of somebody's life, circumstances of their death, and we kind of put ourselves into it. Is there any story that we've told on this podcast that like affected you emotionally?
Oh, God, yes. The one that pops in my head was the Didier Lombard, the France Telecom, where the CEO was pushing people to suicide. And then when it all came to light, I was expecting him to feel all this remorse and beg the city and his company for forgiveness, and he didn't care. He was so calloused and so mean and so cruel and cared about money over people. It broke my heart.
Right. He is an individual we focused on for that story. One of the victims I remember we talked about was the guy that wore a France Telecom shirt when he hung himself with a France Telecom cable, basically in protest of his own business. It's stories like that, like where we can pinpoint an individual, where we can feel compassion, that we have to be able to put ourselves into one person and their story.
Well, on that, Joe, too, talk about September 11th. I remember like it was yesterday. And every day after that was still the newspaper reading days for me. And I had a subscription to a newspaper that came to my house every day. And every day they would print out obituaries for about 20 or 30 people. And I'd read them every single day. And that changed how you felt about it, because they couldn't put all 2,000 at once. So those bite size, and seeing that was a husband, a wife, a son, a daughter, what they did for work, where they were from, really humanized it.
Right. Having one person at a time makes it to where we have to be able to invest ourselves emotionally in a short narrative. And so it's much easier to do that with one person. There was a study back in 2014 where this was by Paul Slovic, and they talk about how compassion diminishes rapidly after one more person is added to a story. So like literally when you get above the number of one, we stop feeling compassion as hard.
So it's not these grocery store shootings, it's not these school shootings, it's just after one person.
Yes.
So it's a car accident of 4 people, we're already numbing ourselves.
Right. And if you watch politics or interviews, that's really evident. Like, people don't look at a group of victims and say, that's awful. They will pick somebody out from the crowd that looks like them and say, that is awful. They will fixate on one person from a tragic incident, and that will stick in their minds. I remember seeing pictures during the war in the Middle East, and I remember doing the same thing. Like, I would hear politicians talk about the need for more troops on the ground. It wouldn't affect me until I saw one person sort of like crying in the streets around like demolished buildings. That's when it would get to me.
Well, when I lived in Seattle, it was in South Seattle, and 4 police officers were having coffee and doing their paperwork before their shift, and they were dressed in their uniform. They got ambushed, and all 4 of them got killed. And it was a huge deal. There was a manhunt for the man who did it, They found him, and the police shot him and killed him. There was a huge, huge funeral for these 4 police officers. They were seen as being killed in the duty. It was the whole city mourned.
Right.
But being that it was in South Seattle, in Tacoma, that's where Fort Lewis Army base is. So a lot of people started saying, these ex-military were saying, well, why don't our service people who have died way more than this get these huge $5 million funerals? We've lost thousands of men and women. Why is there not as important as these police officers?
Right. And I guarantee it's because it's a smaller number and it's people you see every day. Like, you don't see soldiers walking down the streets every day unless you're in a war-torn area. You see a cop and you see a face on the news, and you can identify with one person or a very small number of people. I've watched news recently, and you notice in like the 20-minute news segment, they don't show you 100 pictures from people who died that day. They show you one person's grandparent, and they fixate on that. And that's how, I mean, like, narrative is built on this. Anyone who knows about storytelling knows to do this. They know that one person's story will hit harder than 2 or 3 or 10 or 544,000. Now, the neurology behind this, the reason why it works like this, and this is from the same article, they talk about how the way our neurons fire. So this is the part that gets interesting for me. When you have a neuron firing and it signals from one brain cell or neuron to the next, there's a gap. It's a synapse. And that electrical signal has to transfer between 2 synapses through a neurotransmitter. What this basically means is a spark happens in one part of your brain, travels to the next part.
Okay, thank you for dumbing that down. That was my next question. And that means, it sounds like you're saying that in a different language. Right.
When that spark happens, when it's sparking between synapses, it causes something. It causes a chemical reaction that slows the next synapse that travels the same direction. So if you imagine that, like, a spark goes down a wire, every time another spark goes down that wire, the wire becomes stiffer. It doesn't allow things to travel as quickly. In fact, it dulls it. It literally dulls it whenever you hit that button over and over. So if your compassion, we talk about, is there a compassion tank? Is there like a reservoir of compassion? Can I empty that well? It's not so much like emptying a well of compassion, like the Republican Party was talking about back in November, where they're like, we don't want to send out stimulus quite so soon. It's more like if you hit that circuit over and over. If I tell you about one sad person who died from COVID, you'll feel sad. If I tell you again and again and again, that spark will travel the same path that many times. And every time it does, it stiffens. It's like quicksand. It slows the compassion.
It dulls that.
It literally dulls it. This isn't just compassion. This is how our brain works generally. If you drink alcohol, you have to drink multiple times, and it slowly builds up a tolerance. If you do anything mentally over and over again, you'll build a tolerance to it, or you'll get used to it, and you'll need a higher amount.
Well, it's meant to protect us, right?
Yes.
For when times were a lot tougher, we couldn't dwell and harp on every death and every loss.
Right. Our brains are built to adapt. If you see your neighbor eaten by a lion, that's horrific. If you see your neighbor eaten by a lion every morning, well, then you will adapt and you will overcome. Like that, your brain will get used to it. You won't react as harshly to the stimuli, and then you'll make a spear so you don't have the same happen. So when you're told about the 544,000th person to die of COVID, you put on a damn mask. One last thing I want to cover before we move on, and this is sort of like, we're talking now about the prefrontal cortex, and this comes from a 2020 study that is from the same person, Paul Slovic, and this is done in a scientific report. He talked about brain imaging evidence and why we are numbed by numbers. And he said that the medial prefrontal cortex was activated more by events involving a single person than by involving multiple people. Now, this is kind of the no-duh thing we've been talking about. A event with one person, a single car accident with a single young person dying hits us harder. But that kind of is the scientific evidence that we can't really trust our moral intuitions. Whenever you see people on the news talking about like outrage, like somebody on CNN or Fox, they stand up and they say, "How dare you?" to the other side. They say
Moral outrage.
Moral outrage. Yeah, you can't possibly believe that. Where are your morals? Where are your morals, Todd?
They're lacking.
Yeah. But if we ever stop to recognize that we can't absorb that many deaths, that mentally we actually don't feel compassion for that many people, then everybody has to re-strategize. Everybody has to take a good long look at themselves and say, hey, if, 500,000 deaths doesn't affect me compassion-wise, how can I hinge my entire moral argument on making other people feel compassion for that? If I'm supposed to make the American public look at 500,000 deaths and feel something, but I don't feel anything, then that kind of shoots that right in the foot, that argument. Where do we find compassion when we can no longer feel compassion for like huge numbers? Have you ever been sadder about like a pet dying than for like people that you kind of know?
Well, I grew up, and when I was a kid, if you would have told me that there'd be pet food stores that were big as grocery stores for people, and that pet food would cost more than human people, because we used to, in the old days, you just go buy cat food and dog food. And so there's these huge grocery stores, PetSmart, Petco, where you could take your pets in. Now, this is normal nowadays, but back in the days, that would have seemed mad.
Right, that would have been crazy. I had a ferret that I was feeding a very exotic diet, and the person at the pet store had the gall to recommend that I feed them freeze-dried rodents. And then they told me the bill, and I was like, that would literally be twice as much as I spend on my own food per week.
Well, let me one-up you on that. I had a cat named Sarah. I had her for 18 years, and she lived with me through everything. I took such better care of her than I did of myself, Joe. At the time, I was making some bad decisions, throes of addiction. I was homeless, but I paid for her to stay in a cat condo every night, even though I was sleeping in my car.
Wow.
And I'm not saying to say I'm a good person. I have that much love for her because she's such a good cat. When she passed away, I missed her. I cried harder than any death in my family. It wasn't even close. Explain that to me.
I think that this is something that everyone has experienced. I'm just assuming with how many, if you ever look for cat toys and cat beds online, they get so exotic so fast. I think that people really do feel more for their pets than for other people. Did you hear about, you read about General Grant and how nuts he was for his horse?
Oh, yeah, I did. I read about his favorite horse was called Cincinnati.
Okay.
And let me tell you about Cincinnati. Cincinnati, it was a special horse. Cincinnati was from the same lineage as a horse that was the fastest horse in the country. So it was a very expensive horse, and it was beautiful. It was reported that you couldn't photograph or paint this horse as beautiful it was in person. It was like a special horse, it had a special energy. And Grant loved his horse. He wouldn't let anybody else ride it. He rode into battle, and it was always really calm. But when battle came, it was confident. It was a warrior horse.
Wow.
I think it's funny when let anyone else ride it. Kind of like your car.
Yeah, that is kind of fun. Like you don't give the keys out to your Porsche. Grant won't give out the reins to his horse.
And all the privates were like, you can look at Grant, but don't look at his horse. Don't look it directly in the eyes.
Right. That horse would probably be as temperamental as Ellen.
So he had this horse right until it was going to die. He could have got rid of it. He was a man of many resources. He was offered, Joe, $10,000 to buy this horse, and he said no. Now, let me put that in perspective. $10,000 in the late 1800s, that's $300,000 today for an old horse. This was not a racehorse.
Right.
The horse had no real value. but to him it was worth more than $300,000 today.
Your car where the wheels are falling off and it's, coughing, congestion, and the engine's coming apart. Somebody offers you a house for it, and you're like, nah, I got this. I would like to bury this in my backyard. Yeah. So we want to sort of figure out if compassion is the sole domain of humans. Like, how much compassion do people feel for animals, and how much do animals feel for other people and humans? Like, we want to know if compassion is universal between creatures. You ever heard the term crocodile tears?
Oh, yeah.
I had never heard of that. Like, I'd heard the term over and over. Usually it's used for, like, somebody who is pretending to feel compassion.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, I'm
sobbing,
so sorry
but it's all
for you.
fake. Yeah.
And it's all fake. They're about to do something horrible, and so they're pretending to be compassionate. Turns out crocodiles actually do cry when they eat, but it's not tears. It's just a defense mechanism. Like sharks' eyes roll back when they're chewing. Crocodiles apparently, like, their eyes tear up. However, maybe not crocodiles, but other animals definitely do feel compassion. We talked a couple weeks back about Coco the gorilla, and that she was really into kittens. The first kitten Coco owned, when holding her, like she knew sign language, the gorilla, and she would sign the words, soft, good cat, while holding her over and over again.
That's sweet.
Yeah. I'm glad you smiled because I'm about to make this sad.
You always do. You always ruin everything.
Yeah, I can't go 10 seconds without doing that. Eventually, the cat did. The cat did die. Like her first cat, all ball, wandering onto a highway near their research facility. And when they tried to tell Coco that the kitten had died, Coco ignored them. Like for about 10 minutes, just pretended she didn't hear what they were saying. And then Coco started crying. Gorillas apparently make a hoot sound when they cry. And then she started using the signs for sleep and cat, and sort of folded her arms together and put them on the side of her head. So if you ever wonder if like animals feel genuine compassion, just watch that video. We also have sort of evidence that pretty much all other animals that are sort of like pack animals have these same responses. Seals, manatees, horses, dingoes, dogs, house cats. Some examples include like 27 adult giraffes holding a vigil for one dead baby giraffe. Elephants carrying bones of their dead. Like you can see that in documentaries. I've seen that a few times in a couple documentaries. One event that I was looking up on BBC Earth, they had a great article called "The Truth About Animal Grief." 15 dolphins slowing down and escorting a mother dolphin who was carrying her dead calf. One that I didn't expect, ducks. I don't associate ducks with being, compassionate. But there was a case of 2 ducks that were rescued from a foie gras farm who became friends at the sanctuary. And when one of the ducks died, the other one laid its head on the corpse for hours. So pretty much most creatures on Earth have the ability for compassion. Whether or not they show it, that's basically up to the individual. So
but
when
it's wired in us and animals.
Yeah, pretty much anything that has a limbic system seems to be able to feel compassion. We at some point asked the question, do humans feel more compassion for animals than they do people? And not just their own animals, because we all feel compassion for our own dog or cat. Like your cat, Sarah, that was unique to you. Would somebody else feel the same sort of compassion if they found Sarah in the street, right?
Yeah, without the history of being with her.
Right. So there was a study we're going to link off to. It's referenced in Psychology Today, where they talk about news reports, fake news reports that they gave to college students. And this was like 250 students, so it was a pretty big study group. And they gave them news reports that were completely fake, and it was about descriptions of victims, like victims who had been basically, they found somebody with a broken leg and lacerations who was unconscious. So they faked an attack effectively, or a potential attack. And they gave them scenarios. One scenario, the victim would be one of two humans, a 1-year-old infant, or alternatively a 30-year-old adult. Another scenario was the victim was one of two dogs, a puppy or a 6-year-old adult dog, that is. So among those four, you have the infant, the 30-year-old adult, the adult dog, or the puppy. Which one do you think was the most upsetting for people to read about?
Gotta be the puppy.
The puppy, right? Which one do you think the people were the least upset about?
The older dog.
Okay. The study showed that you're right about the puppy, except for the part where there was any difference between the puppy, the dog, and the baby. The three of those were roughly equivalent. So when people took this test...
Just for the record, I love babies more than puppies. I think. Is that okay?
You missed the part about the baby?
I love.
Okay. I want that on record. Todd loves puppies more than babies. And I'm going to cut this out and send this audio to your wife. So, so for the record, Todd loves babies and puppies. And also, according to the study, pretty much anything that is unable to defend itself got a similar or the same empathetic reaction. So the adult dog, the puppy, and the baby were all roughly equivalent.
So how vulnerable things are.
Exactly. I'm going to read the quote here just so I don't skewer this. Quote, Levin summarizes, "Our results indicated a much more complex situation with respect to age and the species of the victim, with age being the more important component. The fact that adult crime victims receive less empathy than do children, puppies, or full-grown dog victims suggests that adult dogs are regarded as dependent and vulnerable." So yeah, basically, an adult, quote-unquote, doesn't matter so much as, is it vulnerable?
You know, this reminded me of a story. I bet this guy one time. This is one of my bar stories. I'm talking to this guy. He was an attorney, and he was a very specialist attorney, Joe. And he specialized in truck drivers, long haul truck drivers who were in fatal car accidents where they had killed somebody.
Okay.
So we're chatting it up, and I was talking to him about it. I go, well, how much am I worth dead to my family? And he laughed at me. And this is what he said. He said, "Todd, unless you're a 7-year-old girl, you're not worth shit." And that's what we're talking about, right?
Right.
The narrative to the jury.
Yeah, totally. What will a jury sympathize or empathize with? And also, what is your future earning potential? I remember reading an article from NPR about, I believe it was after the 9/11 attacks, person by person who had died, and how much would they be worth, or how much would the families be compensated for their death? And it's entirely based on like age and future earning potential. So both the empathy of a jury matters greatly, and also your age. So for our final myth and the question we want to talk about, we open the narrative by using the phrase that I've heard in politics, pulling the ladder up behind you. Do you think that there is a preference for the upper classes to sort of like have less compassion for the lower class? Do you think that's a real thing?
I do. You know, in all of our studies, a bunch of our shows, you see that with the slumlords. You see that our people are compassionate, Joe, with their own family. They're willing to do whatever they could do for their family, feed them, clothe them, go to the best schools, the best medical care. But the same people who own companies will pay the minimum wage that they can get away with,
right? And
show literally no compassion for their people that made them rich.
Right. During a recent episode we did about American wages, we only really see as much compassion between similar socioeconomic classes.
You're willing to help your neighbor with something, but you're not willing to help a homeless person in the same neighborhood.
Exactly. Yeah. So has that always been the case? Like, do you think throughout history that's kind of held true?
Well, the Civil War, it was a different time. It was a tougher time. And what the research really showed me that a lot of people, if you had money, you ate and were comfortable in Civil War times. And if you didn't have money, you were literally starving.
Okay.
So it was that extreme. And our world's not like that now. No one starves to death in the United States anymore. But during Civil War times, if you weren't of a higher social class, you didn't eat.
Wow. Okay. Do you remember doing the episode about classism where we talk about like celebrity insulation?
Oh, absolutely. That's a good one.
That is one of my absolute favorite articles. We've referenced it so many times, but yeah, Wired had a great article called "Why Are Rich People So Mean?" and it talks about exactly this. We won't really get into that in this episode, but if you ever wonder, does socioeconomic class callous you? Yes, it absolutely does, and there's good references and resources for that. So why do you think, in your opinion, why do you think we lack compassion like right now between classes? Like for instance, just yesterday I saw in the news that they were showing the border detention centers and like people wrapped in like the foil blankets watching TV in cages. And I was thinking we're kind of at a historic low for compassion in America at the moment.
I don't know. I've spent my life, I've served in different ways. I worked at a food bank for, I think, 6 years as a volunteer, and I volunteered at the Humane Society. I noticed that people were a lot more compassionate with the animals than they were with people. They're a lot more patient, a lot more understanding. They gave more of their time and more of their money. And for being, in those two volunteer roles, I saw a lot of it. So I think that I have a good gauge for it. What do you think?
I think that we're kind of facing two things in America. We have a deprivation. Like we are living through a time of historic inequality wealth-wise. And it's really easy to cut off your compassion if you, like for instance, I remember watching, I don't remember if it was Fox or CNN. I watch both just to see like what both sides of the aisle are saying. And I remember somebody complaining that they were getting free healthcare and like toothbrushes in the detention centers. And I thought that is such a wild thing to pick a bone about. Like it's like they're in basically prison.
They shouldn't get any luxuries like that.
Right. But I realized it kind of made sense to me because that's stuff that people aren't getting right now. Like if you are in the lower American class in the moment and you're not in a detention center, you're hurting for health coverage. So if we didn't have this wild lack, then it wouldn't feel like somebody else was getting something we're not.
That's the old Chris Rock joke. A new prison is nicer than an old ghetto.
Right. That's a really good way of putting it. Yeah. We kind of want to talk about where compassion or lack of compassion starts, like in development, because we want to ask the question: is the jerk CEO who is completely uncompassionate? Who screws over his company like Didier Lombard, is that something that happens because they got in that position and it taught them to be a jerk, to be less compassionate, or does it start in childhood? And we will as always, please look up our links, follow them, read the same articles if you have time. But we're going to talk about something called the deprivation mindset. Is there something, Todd, in your adult life that you hoard, that like you get it or you finally have your hands on it and you hoard it or you value it more than you think you should?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, I have a big one, and it's a very unhealthy one. I definitely hoard attention from other people, and I love affection and attention. People knowing who I am. And so when I get that from somebody, I like to push that button over and over and get more and more of it.
Okay.
I know it's not healthy.
Right.
I'm not proud of it, but what about you? What do you hoard?
I think the same. We're both sitting behind a microphone right now, so obviously we lacked something that we're making up for. That and olives. Like I realized that when I was a kid.
Black ones or green ones? Or
black olives. It was, the two things there were never enough of at the table between my brother and I were the meat portion of the meal and olives. So now all I eat is red meat and olives, and it's wildly unhealthy. Deprivation, or what we're talking about today, scarcity mindset. If you lack something at the start of your life, you are more likely to try to make up for it later in life. And you will do so sort of at the, I was going to say the deprivation of others, but it's more like in direct conflict or contest with others. Like if we could, we'll take the attention from somebody else.
So if you and me today joined a Toastmasters group, a new one, neither one of them has two, we'd both compete for the attention of everybody.
Exactly.
And we'd want to be number one.
Yeah, I've actually seen this in play where we don't necessarily compete with each other, but like whoever spoke before you want to smoke them. Like you get up and you show, like you shine just because you need to have that, the attention be higher.
You get a little high from it though, don't you?
Oh, totally, yeah. This mindset kind of carries over. The scarcity mindset goes for food. It goes for attention. It goes for love. It is really just a human coping mechanism, and it affects cognitive tests as well. Like it really is a tangible thing that will affect us in the long term. They did a study about impoverished farmers in India who perform better on cognitive tests at the end of a harvest season when they have resources, when they don't have the scarcity mindset. But at the beginning, when they're running low on money and they haven't gotten that harvest yet, their IQ effectively drops 13 points. So
really?
their IQ is measurably lower when they are at scarcity, when they are deprived of the thing that they are resource farming.
So that goes against what everyone always talks and thinks is you don't get anything until you hit bottom and you have to, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right?
Right. We like to believe that we'll get clever when we're hungry, that we will have deprivation and then it will make us scrappy and smart and sharp. That's not really true. There might be studies to the contrary. But generally speaking, if you are lonely, or you're deprived of food, or you have unhealthy deprivations, it impedes you. It messes with your coping mechanism. It makes you hoard, and it makes you more stressed and anxious about that thing.
So then you're trying to hold on to the little stuff that you have instead of going out and getting more.
Right, exactly. Loss aversion is something we've talked about on the show over and over again. Any level of loss aversion can be can hold you back. So the most evident places that scarcity mindset becomes obvious in the economy and the way sort of like we see it day to day, after holiday sales. So like when people have already spent their money for Christmas and then like the day after Christmas, everything goes on sale. Do you ever feel like you should be buying those 50% off items?
Yeah, absolutely. Those Valentine's Day cards after day after.
Or like you're on Amazon and you're shopping, and then it shows like a time limit on something you're shopping for, the time limited bargains.
And stuff I don't even need, and I'm rushing to buy it.
Right,
buying multiple numbers of things I don't need.
Right, I wasn't going to buy it until they showed a timer counting down where it's going to be 10 cents more if that counter goes to zero. But
fear of loss.
Yeah, absolutely. Crash diets make us more likely to binge eat. Lonely people see themselves more negatively. Just generally speaking, fear of rejection affects us. Pretty much any version of scarcity does not make us sharper and clever. It makes us more loss averse, and it makes us less compassionate. Like if you feel like you're about to lose your job tomorrow, of course you're not going to have as much compassion for somebody in a cage somewhere south, of the border. Like you're going to be upset that they're getting free health coverage when you don't have it. There are a couple of steps to do to combat this sort of scarcity mindset. We're not going to read super deep into these, but something I've talked to you about. I mean, you have talked about having gratitude for things in life. That is one of the number one things they talk about for combating scarcity mindset. Practicing gratitude, not comparing yourself to others.
Oh boy, it's a tough one. The second one's a tough one. The gratitude one, you make a list of things that you're grateful for. Have you ever done that, Joe? Just sat down and made a list of 30 things that you're grateful for.
I have vicariously listened to things you're grateful for, and it made me feel better.
Would you promise me to try it? I swear it's corny, and you think, I don't want to do this. You will actually feel better. You'll be less of a miserable cuss if you do it. So I'll actually pay you to do it.
I'm willing to try it. I'm willing to give it a shot. You can stop obsessing, which is easy for everyone else to say, but I will obsess. But yeah, scarcity mindset, a lot of it is, there's huge obsessive components to it. Take preemptive measures. It's funny you say make a list, because one of the things you can do to combat scarcity mindset is to make a list of the things you actually need. Don't let yourself shop on Amazon when there's a countdown. Make a list of things you absolutely have to get and stick to it. And of course, here's where our Didier low bar comes in. Don't be greedy. That sounds like a real simple, stupid way to put it, but scarcity mindset will make you greedy in certain circumstances. If you can look back at your past and say, I didn't have, this love or this money or something, it makes it easier to justify wanting to take it.
Well, and I've seen too on the greedy part, I think we're in an age in this country of just hoarding, and you see it from all different kind of social classes and different economic. I go to houses all the time that are mansions. For my job, I do estimates for a construction company, that they're hoarding unhealthily, and I see that in manufactured homes, in parks that are. So I see that across the board. You're also seeing a lot with these. What are these storage places? People pay $100 a month to store stuff they don't use. That's why it's in storage.
Or that they will never use, yeah.
You're absolutely right. They'll never even look at it again. I have friends that have had storage units for 20 years and haven't opened them.
And for our current economic time, that makes sense. I remember my grandmother came out of the Depression, and she hoarded. Like she just knew you couldn't trust anything, including banks. She would hoard soap and dry beans and things. So when you see people in mansions hoarding things, when you see there is a glut of millionaires in Silicon Valley who are building bunkers and hoarding things, and that's their hobby now. So we are in kind of a new sort of golden age of hoarding and wealth inequality, and it kind of encourages the scarcity mindset. So can we talk about Grant as he sort of is seen by history? Like he's not looked at as sort of like a favorite president or anything.
No, he's got one of those rankings as, through most historians, as one of the worst presidents. He was the 18th president of the United States. Now, I want to keep in mind, and I want to share, is that he took office when this country was reeling from the Civil War. There was a scarcity of everything. That war depleted this country. It was divided. It was a terrible time.
You're right. I remember reading that they were pouring bullets from scrap metal and things.
Yeah, there was no coins because it was all used for bullets. Now, what do you think about when you think about civil rights? You think of Lincoln, right?
Yeah.
Well, Grant and him were buddies, right? Lincoln was a big fan of Grant. Grant was a big fan of minorities. He really advocated for Native Americans. He even appointed a General Eli Parker to be head of the Native Americans. He had laws made that made it licensed traders could not do business deals that were unethical with tribes.
Wow, that's really forward thinking.
And it's very compassionate. He also fought. Just because slaves were free, they're no longer slaves, it doesn't mean they had all the rights of everyone else. He recognized African American people as citizens, and he fought for them to have the right to vote. And at the time, that was very unpopular, North or South.
Right. So do you think that the dichotomy of somebody who is such a brutal Civil War leader and general, him being this compassionate afterward, do you think there's like two sides of the coin thing going on there? Like, how do you chalk that up?
He's a complicated guy. There's a lot to take in here.
Okay.
My case is still open on that. What do you think?
I sometimes wonder if compassion might come from like not a darker place, but maybe compassion comes from having seen what it looks like when somebody else doesn't have compassion.
Well, I can tell you this, the Carnegies and the Rockefellers were known as vicious, brutal, bloodthirsty business people that would let people die over pennies. They didn't care.
Mm-hmm.
But later in their life, they gave away money at the same rate. They were kind and generous in a way that they weren't. So maybe it's with aging.
Oh, that could be it. Yeah.
You won a war, you conquered a war, and now you want to. And I don't think it's a sign of guilt. I just think he did everything, pedal to the metal.
Huh. There really might be something to that. So when are we going to be old enough to be compassionate?
Now, this I love. Okay, he did an autobiography. He did it in 2 volumes, and it was put out in 1885. It was 1,200 pages. Right?
It's a little long-winded.
Well, he did a lot in his life, to be fair, right? Him,
True.
FDR, Lincoln. These guys did more than most of us. But out of those 1,200 pages, he hardly mentioned his presidency.
Selling firewood on the streets was probably like 1,000 pages, and then presidency is 2.
So maybe he wasn't so proud of it. I did do a lot of reading that I think one of the mistakes he made in his presidency was who he surrounded himself with.
Okay.
It sounded like he appointed a bunch of knuckleheads. He did more about the people he hired people he liked, not people who were best for the job.
Well, we've seen that kind of pan out in local modern politics too. So
pretty much every study or scientific source points towards our narrative-driven brain for why we don't have compassion for the masses. In fact, compassion drops off sharply as soon as the number of suffering victims increases from just 1. And repeatedly having the same compassion circuit tapped in our head literally desensitizes that circuit. In short, our brains might be built to go numb after big number tragedies. Because while a death in our tribe is tragic, the death of another tribe far away is significantly less so. Yet political leaders throughout history have proven capable of compassion after the conflict has died down. Just ask Grant, an extremely unlikely source of compassion, if his critics can be believed. If you've ever wondered why greed can overwhelm a person's compassion, it might be worth remembering the scarcity mindset. Lacking things in childhood, especially fundamental things like love, compassion, or a sense of importance, can lead to an overwhelming impulse to hoard resources. The greedy CEO who gets caught driving tenured staff to quit so he can hire cheap contractors might seem like an unfeeling bastard, but there's a human mechanism and a sense of deprivation behind that greed. That doesn't mean we should forgive him, but understanding greed can go a long way in de-arming it. Lastly, if you want to overcome compassion fatigue while spreading your message, use narrative. Get someone hooked onto a story that demonstrates a need. Use an individual as your example, an individual who stands for the needs of a group, like Rosa Parks, Walter Gladstone, or Anna Frank. That's the key to penetrating the numb haze that is compassion fatigue. Tell a good story. You've been listening to The Re-Engineered You. Thank you so much for listening to the show. You mean the world to us. We have a new episode every week.
You can connect with us at www.re-engineeredyou.com. That's where we have research links, show notes, and blog articles for each of our episodes. We also appreciate feedback, and we love spirited debates.
We're not experts at anything, but we've got an opinion on everything.
Speaking of opinion, do you want to read a review?
Yes, this is from my friend. His name is Zay. He works at Lux Cryotherapy. And what you know cryotherapy is where you freeze yourself 200 degrees below zero.
Right, yeah. It doesn't penetrate the skin completely.
Yeah, it makes you feel like it takes all the inflammation out of your body. It's very good for you. All the athletes do it. A lot of people do it for anti-aging. But he runs the place down in Portland. He's from Seattle area, and this is his review. Brilliant podcast. Will definitely change your outlook on life. Thank you so much for your kind words, Zay. We appreciate that.
Thank you, Zay. Take it easy.